Okay, it's time to get started, and it's so nice to see where everybody's logging in from. Welcome. I want to thank everybody for joining us at Sharsheret tonight for Beyond BRCA, Myths and Facts about Cancer Risk. Tonight, we're going to take a deeper dive into hereditary cancer, including a number of mutations that impact risk for breast cancer, as well as several other types of cancer. We'll also explore who's impacted by these mutations. And in that process, we're going to hear from two Sharsheret callers. My name is Melissa Rosen. I am the Director of Training and Education at Sharsheret. And again, thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I have a couple of quick housekeeping items I need to share. I want you to know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with a transcript on Sharsheret's website. Please note that participants' faces and names are not included in this recording, but if you'd like to remain private even tonight, you can do so by turning off your video and changing your screen name. Alternatively, you can choose to call into the webinar, and instructions for that are in the chat box. You may have noticed all participants were muted upon entry. Please stay muted throughout the presentation. We recommend you keep your screen on speaker view so that you will be able to see the presentation clearly. You can find this option in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. I have to say, we received so many really insightful, impressive questions before tonight's webinar, and I expect there'll be additional ones now. Please use the chat box, which you can access at the bottom of your screen, to type in any questions, and we will do our best to answer all of them. Any questions we don't get to tonight will be addressed by email over the next week. I do need to remind you that Sharsheret's been providing telehealth services for the breast and ovarian cancer communities for almost 20 years, and the pandemic has not changed that. We continue to be there for each and every one of you. One of our many programs to help women and their families navigate the cancer experience that may be of particular interest to those on tonight's webinar is our Genetics for Life program. As a part of that program, you can speak one-on-one with our certified genetic counselor, who you'll be hearing from tonight, about family history, concerns about cancer risk, the implications of genetic counseling and testing for you and your family. And you can actually even have a family conference call. You can gather your family on a call to let us help communicate with them about hereditary risk and proactive steps that each family member can take. And as always, all of our services are 100% confidential and 100% free. As we move into the webinar itself, I want to remind you that Sharsheret is a national non-for-profit organization. And we provide cancer support and education, but we do not provide medical advice or perform any medical procedures. The information provided by Sharsheret is not a substitute for medical advice or treatment for a specific medical condition. You should not use this information to diagnose or treat a health problem. As always, seek the advice of your physician or a qualified healthcare provider with any questions you might have regarding a medical condition. Okay, so let's get to it. We are so lucky to have Peggy Cottrell as not only a member of Sharsheret's team year-round, but as tonight's main presenter. Peggy is a certified genetic counselor and a graduate of the Sarah Lawrence College Master of Science in Genetic Counseling program. At Sharsheret, as our genetics program coordinator, Peggy consults with women and families and answers individual questions about family history, BRCA and other mutations, personal risk, and more. And she has a very valuable and all too rare skill of making a complicated topic clearly understandable. Before I turn the program over to Peggy, we've created an interactive opportunity as part of tonight's webinar. Throughout her presentation, you will see polls pop up on the screen to challenge your knowledge and expose myths related to hereditary cancer genetics. We encourage you to participate, and the answers to the polls will also be posted live. Thank you, Peggy. Let's get started.
Okay, great. Welcome everybody to our presentation tonight, and I'm gonna share my screen here. Oops. Okay.
Please go ahead and answer that poll.
Okay, so what percentage of breast cancer is inherited? 2%, 5 to 10%, 30 to 40%, or more than 50%? Okay, and it looks like, you know what, I'm gonna have to stop share and reshare. I'm very sorry. I'm having a problem. I'm very sorry about this. Okay, now I'm on the right slide. So it looks like we have a smart group here because for the most part, people selected the correct answer, which was 5 to 10%. So most cancer happens for reasons that we can't explain. A lot of it has to do with things in the environment, our lifestyle factors, and a big chunk of it is just chance. Different cancers are more or less likely to be inherited depending on the type. So breast cancer, we think about 5 to 10% of the time is related to a strong inherited predisposition. Ovarian cancer, it's probably more than that. Other cancers, less. Anyone can get cancer, and cancer arises in our bodies as there are genetic changes that happen not in our inherited cells, but in cells anywhere in our body. And as those changes accumulate in our body cells over time, we can gradually change our normal cells into cancer cells. Now, if someone has an inherited mutation, it means that they start one step ahead on this pathway. So instead of starting at normal cell, someone with an inherited mutation starts at the 1 mutation point. And you can see on this pathway that if someone starts with an inherited mutation, it's more likely that they'll develop cancer. And also because the pathway has become shorter, it's more likely that it'll happen to them at a younger age. But someone could have that first mutation and never develop the additional mistakes that it takes to develop cancer. And so that's a little bit of explanation here. So let's go to the next poll. This is our quiz 2. And the question here is, what population should worry about BRCA 1 and 2 carriers? Ashkenazi Jews and those with European ancestry, or anyone of any ethnicity? Okay, and we have a mixture here of opinions on this, and I'm going to tell you that it's the last one that's correct, really anyone of any ethnicity. Anyone anywhere around the world can carry a mutation in BRCA 1 and 2 and in any cancer predisposition gene. I think there's a misconception out there because Ashkenazi Jews have a higher risk, 1 in 40 compared to more like 1 in 400 in the general population, that Ashkenazi Jews are the only ones who have to worry about this. And there's a second misconception there, that it is only white populations that have to worry about and not people of other ethnicities. But it turns out if we look at how often people around the world carry mutations in BRCA 1 and 2, we see the same thing in populations throughout Africa, throughout Asia, South America, North America. There are very few populations where we see an increased incidence, but one of those is Ashkenazi Jews. And so we have to be more careful in our community, but anybody can carry mutation in BRCA 1 and 2. And then finally, my first sentence, I just want to remind everybody that men are just as likely as women to carry these mutations. And so even though a woman who has a BRCA1 or 2 mutation has a higher chance to develop cancer than a man does, men still do develop cancer related to BRCA1 and 2, and they can pass it to their unaffected, their children, their offspring. So let's move to the next poll. What type of cancer is likely to be hereditary? So number 1, lung, skin, and cervical cancer. Number 2, breast and ovarian cancer. Number 3, breast, ovarian, colon, uterine, pancreatic, prostate, melanoma, and stomach cancer. Or number 4, all cancers are hereditary. So choose your answers and then we'll see what is correct. So we have a mix of, so first of all, I'll tell you, by not choosing number 1, you're correct. Those are cancers that are almost always happening by chance. But the correct answer is number 3. So when we're looking at a family tree for cancers that could be inherited, we're looking for cancers like breast, ovarian, uterine, colon, etc. When we see other kinds of cancers, those don't add into the formula. But we're looking for all of these other cancers and lots of other genes because we're able to do a test that's much more comprehensive nowadays. So if you look at our little diagram here, we see breast cancer in the first one, and then surrounding it, we see lots of different genes that can predispose to breast cancer. And I'm not going to read all of the names because that's somewhat less interesting, but many different genetic mutations can lead to the development of breast cancer. And in the same way, in the second small picture, we see a genetic mutation, TP53, and mutations in TP53 cause a lot of different kinds of cancer. And you can see many of those cancers surrounding the TP53 diagram: breast, ovarian, gastric, colorectal, pancreatic, melanoma, prostate, and endometrial. And so we see that each gene that we look at has a different pattern of the cancers that result. And so it's not that we're looking at lots of other mini BRCA1 and 2 genes, but in fact, all of the other genes that we look at have their own particular unique pattern of cancers that develop. But because of the overlap between one syndrome and another, we tend to do current testing as a panel. And so if you go in nowadays to get a test for BRCA1 and 2, you can still get a test for only BRCA1 and 2. But typically, you're going to be offered a panel that could include anywhere from 25 to as many as 85 different genes on it. And some of those are going to be very obscure and cause very rare kinds of cancer. Some of those genes are going to increase the risk for cancer in a very subtle way. So it's really important when you get a big test like this done, not to understand all the genes ahead of time, but to make sure that if you do test positive, you get a very careful explanation of what the implications are for the gene that was identified. Okay, let's go to our next quiz. So hereditary cancer affects only children, mostly women, rarely men, only women, or both men and women, depending on the type. Okay, take a moment to collect your answers and we'll see what we get. Okay, amazing. You guys are super smart because that is the correct answer. 98% have chosen our correct answer. So we want to really emphasize in tonight's webinar that this is something for men to be aware of as well as women. And so certainly men with mutations in BRCA1 and BRCA2 are at an increased risk for cancer, not as much as women, but they may develop prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer, melanoma, or male breast cancer. But importantly, many of the other genes that we look at can cause more risk to men. So for example, men could be at an increased risk for colon cancer and for other cancers if they're carrying these gene mutations. Let's go to our next poll. So if someone's a carrier for hereditary cancer, I forgot to change the slide here. Okay. Someone's a carrier for hereditary cancer, what's the chance they will get cancer? Okay, and so most of you have chosen the correct answer, which is 4, depends on the gene. But there's a reason why this is tricky, and that's probably because really all of them are correct because it depends on the gene. So sometimes we do a genetic test and we find someone is a carrier, but their risk to develop cancer is still pretty low, maybe only 10%. Sometimes it's more like 50%. 87 is a number that gets quoted a lot of times for the risk of breast cancer with BRCA1, which is why I picked that somewhat unusual number. But it's really important to understand that it depends on the particular gene, what is going to be the risk. And so I'm going to mention a couple other genes that we want to look at here. There's a mutation that's very common in people with Ashkenazi ancestry. It's in a gene called APC. And APC is a gene that predisposes to colon cancer. And there's a mutation that's common in about maybe as many as 10% of Ashkenazi Jews. And very often when we get testing done, this is one that pops up. It's called I1307K. And it's a very specific change that's common in APC in the Ashkenazi community. And someone who carries this mutation, instead of having a 5 or 6% chance to develop colon cancer, has about twice that. So maybe they have about a 10 to 12% chance to develop colon cancer. And this could be enough to lead to a change in screening. It can be important to find out about. But overwhelmingly, when we might be looking for something else and we're testing someone with Ashkenazi ancestry, this finding can pop up. But obviously with BRCA1 and BRCA2, the risk to develop breast cancer can be very high, somewhere between 50 to as much as 85%. And so depending on what the risk is for each of the different types of cancer, someone may choose to be taken care of in a different way. Okay, so now we're up to our next quiz. If someone carries a mutation in BRCA1, what should they do? They could have a bilateral mastectomy, add an annual MRI to their breast cancer regimen, remove their ovaries and tubes between the ages of 35 and 40. All of the above are recommended, or only 1 in 3 are recommended. This is a trick question. This is like one of the hated A, B, C, A and C, B and C, all of the above, none of the above. Okay, very good. So you guys have done well on this question again, because this one is really all of the above are recommended and it depends. And I want to talk about this a little bit more. One of the questions that I very often get from people who are wondering if they need to have this test done, they'll say to me, Peggy, listen, I'm already super careful. I get my mammogram every year, my sonogram, my doctor examines my breasts. Why would I really need to know if I have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation? And the reason why is besides, and these people will say, listen, I'm not having prophylactic surgery. I don't believe in cutting out body parts, but tell me why I need to have this test done. And the reason why is we make a big difference by adding screening. And so individuals, women with a BRCA1 or BRCA2 mutation will qualify for high-risk breast cancer screening, which includes adding an annual MRI to their screening. And by adding that annual MRI, we increase significantly the detection of breast cancer enough that we really feel comfortable giving women a choice. We don't say to women, if you have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, you have to have a prophylactic bilateral mastectomy. That might be a good choice for some people, but for other women, the better choice is the careful screening. But it's really important that the careful screening include the MRI. And that's because the studies that are done seem to show that the specificity and sensitivity of the MRI really improves our ability to find the breast cancer at the very earliest stage. Now, I think probably if you carefully examine the statistics, you could see that there is an edge of a benefit to the double mastectomy, but not so much that we require people to go down that pathway. So again, to my person at the beginning who says, why do I I'm already being careful about my screening. The point here is that there is an additional screening test that can really improve detection, and it's available to people who really know that they need it. A breast MRI does not make sense for people at average risk. It really makes sense for people who have that additional higher risk. So we'll move on to quiz number 7. If someone is already diagnosed with cancer, number 1, it's too late for a genetic test to help. Number 2, it can help guide treatment. Number 3, it can help interpret testing of a family member. Or number 4, both 2 and 3. Okay, another excellent poll result by the group. Thank you. And let me explain a little bit of why this is the case. Okay, so very often women will say to me, you know, I already had cancer. So how does it make any sense for me to have this test? How is it going to do me any good? It's too late. Cancer already happened. And so there are 3 good reasons why it's important if you've had cancer to have the genetic test. And the first one is that positive results can help inform the negative results of other people in the family. And what does this mean? So let's imagine a scenario. Let's say that I have cancer. I got breast cancer when I was very young. And so now my daughter is worried. Is it going to happen to her? So she goes to her doctor gives her the genetic test, and the result is negative. So she might say, excellent, I'm not at increased risk. But it turns out that there are things that predispose to cancer that are inherited that we don't know how to look for yet. And so my daughter's seemingly negative result, if I don't get tested, we're not sure what it means. And so when someone in a family who doesn't have cancer tests negative for a mutation, we call that uninformative results when there is no one in the family who's tested positive. And that's because we don't know why I got cancer in the first place. So if we change the story and now we say that I got the genetic test and I test positive, so now we know what's causing my cancer. And if my daughter gets the test and her result is negative, then that's what we call a true negative result. And someone who has a true negative, it doesn't mean that they're never going to get cancer, because we said already at the beginning, anybody can get cancer. And it even happens to people who are in families with people with an inherited mutation and their result is negative. And I can tell you, I see that many times when testing people in a family. Someone in a family with an inherited mutation develops cancer. They say, I must have the mutation. And it turns out that they don't. So that's the first reason why it's important for the affected person to get tested. Second reason is that for most inherited cancer genes, there are more than one type of cancer that's increased. And so let's say I develop breast cancer when I'm 40. and I don't get the genetic testing done, but I do very well. I get treated, my breast cancer is cured. But then when I'm 50, I come down with ovarian cancer. So that's what we're trying to prevent when we do the genetic test. You got cancer once, we don't want you to get cancer twice. So again, that's a second good reason. And the third good reason is that now we have targeted medications. And so there are medicines called PARP inhibitors, which are sometimes available for those with inherited mutations to take to help treat their actual cancer. And these medications were first studied with ovarian cancer, and they have been proven to work really well with ovarian cancer. They're also being studied and work well in breast cancer, in prostate cancer, and in pancreatic cancer. And so, again, really important for someone, especially with an advanced cancer, to get genetic testing. And most insurance companies now actually have a diagnosis of an advanced or metastatic cancer is a reason to allow for genetic testing, even in the absence of family history, because of the possibility of looking for a targeted medication. Okay, let's go to the next quiz. Who will inherit a BRCA1 or 2 mutation? Only the daughters, all of the sons and daughters, half of the children will get it. Each child has a 50% risk to inherit it. So make your choices. Okay, so you see those polls, and again, we have a smart audience. The correct answer is number 4. And I'm showing you here an example of a pedigree. And this is how genetic counselors and other genetic experts draw out family trees. And so when we draw a family tree, the squares are men, because men are square. The women are circles. We put a line through people who are deceased. And usually we either color in or put little wedges in that show people who have been affected. So you can see in this particular family tree, the first person at the top, that's the grandparents, and the first person who had this particular mistake was the grandfather. And there was a 50% chance that he could pass this mutation on. And in this particular case, there are special cases where there are genetic diseases that are linked to X or Y chromosomes, and that's more complicated. But here we're talking about genetic disorders that are traveling on the numbered chromosomes, which are the same in men and women. And so in that case, it's 50-50 chance of being passed on. And you can see he passed it to a son and to a daughter. And then the daughter also passed it to a son and a daughter. Sometimes people, by chance, have an inherited mutation and don't pass it to any of their children. And that is awesome. Sometimes people have an inherited mutation and they can pass it to all of their children. I once worked with a family where I saw someone who was the 7th sibling yet to be tested, and all 6 previous siblings had tested positive. And she, the 7th, also tested positive. So that's unlikely odds, but it's each individual has the same 50-50 chance. So sometimes people think, well, you know, my brother and sister already tested positive, so chances are I'm not going to have it. But that's actually not the way it works. And we know this from flipping coins, that each time you flip a coin, it's 50-50, and it doesn't matter what the previous flip was. So let's move to the next quiz. If you test positively for a cancer genetic mutation, you will lose your medical insurance. 2, your children will lose their medical insurance. 3, you may be denied or be charged a higher rate for life, disability, or long-term care insurance, or all of the above. Think about it. Okay, so again, a smart audience has mostly chosen the correct answer. So I'll explain to you just briefly a little bit about the laws that are related to genetic discrimination. There is a law called GINA, which stands for Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And this law prevents medical insurance from discriminating based on on some kind of genetic finding. Now, there's additional protection for medical insurance in the Affordable Care Act, but what I'd like to remind people of, as we wonder what might happen to the Affordable Care Act, that there is pre-existing protection in this law for genetic mutations and medical insurance. There are a couple of small exceptions to this law. One of them is the military. So if you have questions or concerns, you need to speak to an expert. Life, disability, and long-term care insurance may be affected, and it depends on the state. And one of the interesting things that just came out in the last month or so is one of the first states, Florida, has passed a law to protect people with genetic disorders from discrimination in life, disability, and long-term care, which is a really amazing decision by their legislature. So go Florida. But states vary, and I have seen in my own experience that New York can be somewhat difficult. In my experience, I've had more people with problems with these kind of insurances in New York when I work there than in my practice in New Jersey. And if you have concerns, I've put 2 web pages on this slide. You can take a look and check out. You can always speak with a insurance broker with these questions. And what I generally tell people is it's more important to have a test that could save your life than to die with good life insurance. And so you really want to make sure, put as much as you can, put your life insurance, your disability insurance, all of those things in good order before you have the genetic test. But don't use this concern to stop yourself from having a test that you need to have done. Okay, test 10. Your genetic test is negative. What does it mean? You're at low risk to develop cancer. You're at high risk to develop cancer. Your risk depends on your family history, or your risk depends on your family history and results of other family members. Okay, very good. Good work. So the correct answer is the last one. It depends. And this is related to the story that I explained before when I was talking about my informative or uninformative negative results from my imagined scenario where myself and my daughter were having testing. Whenever I have someone tell me their result, and this happens a lot of times when I have Sharsheret callers, they say, I got a negative result, what does it mean? I got a positive result, what does it mean? So it's really difficult for me to explain to someone what the implications of their results are unless I really am able to look at their family tree and see what's going on. And that's because if someone has a negative result, but they have lots of people in their family who've had cancer, and none of those people have had genetic testing that's been positive, then we have to surmise that there could be something inherited that we don't know how to identify yet. And therefore that person is still at high risk and needs to have that very careful screening. And insurance generally allows for that. There are calculations that are done by your doctor based on your family history and other parameters that can qualify you to get a breast MRI, even if you don't have an identified inherited mutation. It turns out that there are things called SNPs, which stands for single nucleotide polymorphism. And what that means basically is all of us have DNA that's slightly different from other people in ways that are most of the time not important. So if we were looking at a particular gene here, we've identified 3 different people. And here, some people at a particular location in the gene have an A, and the alphabet of DNA is G, C, A, and T. So here, some people have an A, some people have a G, and some people have a T. And most of the time, these differences don't cause any major change. It might affect what we look like or how tall we are, things like that, but sometimes they can have an impact on disease. So let's imagine that the people who have the T, as opposed to the G or the A, have about a 0.5% higher chance to get breast cancer. So that's not very much of a difference. But it turns out that there are, thousands and thousands of these SNPs that are occurring in our DNA. And so even if by themselves they don't make that much difference, if you had enough of them that added up into risk in one particular disease, that could actually cause a problem. So SNPs is where we really want to try to go in learning more about all of those families that look inherited, and we don't know why that is. And so there are labs that are working on SNP risk score tests, but they are really at a beginning stage, and most insurance companies aren't willing to accept a score from these SNPs as something to qualify, let's say, for a breast MRI or to qualify for a mastectomy. The other problem with these SNP tests is because most of the research that's been done in the United States on these SNPs have been done in white populations. And so people of color can often not get a SNP test. The ones that are available only work for people who are white. So this is another problem and shows again an area where we have a lot more work to do. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm gonna stop my share and pass to Melissa.
Thank you so much, Peggy. I always learn something new when we speak, and tonight was no different. I appreciate that. A reminder that there were some wonderful questions that got put into the chat box. We're going to do questions at the end. We're not ignoring them. Tonight, as I mentioned, we also have an opportunity to hear from 2 Sharsheret callers. We gain so much insight as we take medical information and hear it through a personal experience. And that's why we have callers often share their stories. Our first caller, Bill, is a husband of 43 years to his best friend. He's a proud father of a 35-year-old communications director and senior advisor, a caregiver to 2 wonderful dogs. He's also a former journalist and a more than 8-year survivor of male breast cancer, who also happens to have a BRCA2 mutation. Bill.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Everyone can hear me? Good?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for this opportunity. As Melissa said, I am an 8.5-year survivor of male breast cancer. And before I diagnosed myself, in fact, I was not aware of the fact that men could get breast cancer. 8.5 years ago, there was very little literature about it. And I woke up one morning with a blood spot on the t-shirt that I slept in. And I didn't think much of it. I had a dog who had had some eye surgery, and I thought maybe it was just a little weeping from that. And the next morning I knew that she hadn't been near me, and I had a clean shirt on, and the spot was there again. Pardon me. And that was at about 6 in the morning. And by about 7 o'clock in the morning, I was pretty certain that I had ductal cancer. I had to wait until 9 o'clock to call my doctor, to get an appointment. Got a typical male response in that the receptionist and office manager went completely silent when I mentioned that the reason I needed to see the doctor that day and not in 10 days was that I thought I had breast cancer. At that time, and even to this date, men are not really thought of and included in the discussion. And within 5 weeks, I'd had a mammogram in a pink paper robe with a technician who had never done a mammogram on a man. an ultrasound, also with a technician who'd never done a breast examination on a man, and a needle biopsy. And it came back positive. And so within 5 weeks of my figuring out that I had breast cancer, I had my first mastectomy. Because I was so proactive, because I reacted so quickly, I was extraordinarily lucky, thank God. And it was after the pathology reports and all, I was classified as stage 0. My oncologist put me on tamoxifen because it was an ER positive cancer. And then I started doing additional research and started learning about the genetics of breast cancer and learned about the BRCA gene mutations. It took 3 requests of my insurance company to approve my request to have the gene test done. There was only one company at the time that did it, a company called Myriad, and they didn't allow anyone else to use their technology to examine those specific genes. Came back positive, and with more research, recognized the fact that this was something that was passed on to me by my parents, one of them or both. My father was not living at the time, so we couldn't get him tested. But my mother got tested, my sister got tested, and my son got tested. And between them all, my mother was the only one who was negative. My sister and my son both were BRCA2 positive. I went ahead and scheduled a second mastectomy prophylactically. I didn't want to have to live with the fear that I would get breast cancer again, or one of the other cancers, which I couldn't really prepare for other than being diligent. My son chose to have prophylactic double mastectomy with reconstruction. My sister chose to just be very diligent and up the frequency with which she was having exams. Everybody is healthy right now. And in looking back at my family tree, we realized that on my father's side of the family, there were a large number of incidences of breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and a number of the others, in fact, all that I was able to determine in women. We were not able to find out if any men in the family also had breast cancer. So I've been on a soapbox ever since, and have addressed many different organizations. I frequently talk to groups at Las Robles Hospital here in Thousand Oaks. I talk to a number of other groups. I'm a member of 4 or 5 different support groups, and I do peer counseling. The testing genetically for me was very important because it did several things. It enabled me to illuminate the issue to my family, to make sure that my son took care of this and was informed, to make sure that my sister also was as well. And that was really, for me, extraordinarily important. I wanted to make sure that everybody was armed with as much information as possible. And so my son now knows that though he has a higher risk for a number of other cancers because of the BRCA2 mutation, he knows that he's not going to have to worry about breast cancer as one of them. So my having gotten it is a blessing in a way.
Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing your story. It was a perspective we don't hear as much about as we should, like you said, and like somebody commented. And so we're grateful for that. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Our next caller is Lindsay. She is a breast cancer survivor who originally tested negative for BRCA mutations, only to find out that, in fact, after her diagnosis, she learned she had a mutation called PALB2. She's a huge advocate for knowing your genetic status, as well as someone who is involved with many Facebook groups and support groups. She shares her story in the hopes that it can save others. So Lindsay, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. I always knew breast cancer was a part of my family. My paternal aunt had breast cancer at 38 and 39. Her paternal aunt had passed away from the disease in her 40s. My great-grandmother, my great-grandmother's brother, and my great-grandmother's sister all had breast cancer. So I started proactively getting screened in my late 20s. I would have an MRI and a mammogram every year, spaced 6 months apart. But I struggled with getting the mammogram paid for, unfortunately, because they always claimed that, well, your mother, your child, or your sister didn't have breast cancer. Now, as you know, my family history is on my father's side. I have a brother and I have 2 sons. So that was really frustrating for me. But nonetheless, we still continued on. And in 2013, I went to see a genetic counselor, as you mentioned, Melissa, and I had the BRCA testing, which turned out to be negative. However, the genetic counselor at the time told me, you know what, there's just something there that we don't know about. And I would just strongly suggest to you that you continue on your screening regimen and continue to be examined. And thank God she said that, because those words literally saved my life, because exactly a year to the day of my BRCA 1 and 2 test, I was on the operating table getting a double mastectomy because I had been diagnosed with breast cancer at 36 years old. My kids were 5 and 7 at the time. It was very challenging. I ended up having chemotherapy because of my oncotype score, my family history, and my age. But the day before I started chemotherapy, I saw an article in the New York Times, and it talked about the POLB2 genetic mutation. So I brought the article and said to my doctor, hey, could I be tested for this? And she said, sure, we're going to do a full panel. And the POLB2 mutation was the one that I ended up having. So I went through treatment, went on tamoxifen, had reconstructive surgery, and I never felt quite right after my chemotherapy. I still was very fatigued. I was told it was going to take a while for the chemo to get out of my body, but I just, deep down, I didn't feel like there was anything. I felt like there was something wrong. And in 2016, I was having some pain in my arm, and I thought, oh, well, maybe I'm having a bout with lymphedema. I was node negative when I had my double mastectomy, and I was classified as stage 1. But I felt a lump under my armpit, and I was kind of poking around and found it and brought it to my doctor, and they were like, oh, it's nothing. 3 different doctors, actually. And when I went to my normal oncology appointment, they said, let's check that out. And it turns out I had localized recurrence of my breast cancer. I went and had an axillary dissection where I had 14 lymph nodes removed, and 10 of which were positive. So I was back in chemotherapy, had radiation this time. I chose to have my ovaries and tubes removed. But I was told, because of my mutation, that they were treating my cancer similar to a BRCA2 mutation, since POLB2 stands for the partner and localizer of BRCA2. So, thankfully, I've been healthy ever since. I get CT scans now every year. But there's been some barriers in my family because of that mutation. I have a first cousin who decided she wanted to get tested, and her insurance company said, no, you may not. You need to prove that someone in the family has this mutation. So she called me and asked me for my, hey, would you mind sharing your results with me? And of course I did. But it's amazing that, just a few years ago, this is still an issue. Other than that cousin, we are the only two in the family that have been tested. And, you know, my children have asked, so when do I get tested? I have a 14-year-old and 11-year-old, and they've asked the question, and, you know, I've answered it as honestly as I can. But, you know, it's a complicated thing. And, you know, I'm sure someday they will be tested. And, you know, I'm encouraging other family members to get tested. And that's my story. And thank you guys so much for allowing me to share.
Thank you very much. You know, it's not always easy to share personal stories, but it's so instructive to those who hear it. It really reminds us that we need to be proactive about our own health, and it really does. It saves lives through education. So thank you for that. So we have a few minutes left. I want to get to some questions, but I also want to assure everybody that all questions will be answered, even if not by tonight, but by blog posts, which we will send to you, or by email. So if your question wasn't answered, please don't worry. Let's start with a first question. So one is, how do I know when I should pursue an updated test? And at what age should I consider screening if I haven't screened yet?
The age to consider having a genetic test done, we don't test children generally. So you're old enough to have a test done when you're 18. The age when we might do something differently is probably more like 25. So that can be a good age to have the testing done. But in terms of an upgraded test, so someone who only had testing for BRCA 1 and 2 is definitely a person who should consider an updated test. A panel test can be done even without insurance for $250. So people sometimes worry, oh, this is very expensive, I can't afford thousands of dollars. This test no longer costs thousands of dollars. There's a lot of competition out there. Prices have come down significantly. And if you're not sure if you had a panel or not, or how long ago it was, you can get a copy of your results from your doctor and speak to a genetic counselor. It's one of the questions I field very often at Sharsheret. Callers call in and say, do you think I need to have another test done? And I can take a look at your test and your family history and let you know if that's a good idea.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Somebody asked, what happens if both parents carry either the same mutation or two mutations different mutations that raise risk?
So very often, if people carry two different mutations, they don't add together. And so usually you have the risks that go with each one, but if those risks are the same, it doesn't double. And having different mutations, again, doesn't seem to cause any problem. Sometimes if the same mutation is present in both parents and they pass the same mutation to the child, it can result in a genetic disorder that's much more significant. And that, in the case of many of the breast and ovarian cancer genes like BRCA 1 and 2, that's Fanconi anemia. Sometimes it happens also with Lynch syndrome. People can inherit. Lynch syndrome is a syndrome that predisposes to colon and uterine cancer. And if someone has two mutations in the same Lynch gene, that can also cause a more severe presentation in a child. So it's always worth thinking about, if you have a strong family history of cancer, to get a genetic test before you have children.
Thank you for that. Someone asked when and how to tell, the interesting question. This person asked about sharing this information with daughters about their possibility of carrying a mutation. So now they understand it won't just be after tonight's webinar, it's daughters and sons that need to worry about it. But how and when should we start making this connection for our children?
So it's a very complicated question, and I will share that we have a booklet at Sharsheret that we're happy to send to you called "How Do I Tell My Children About My Cancer Gene?" And every family has to make this decision in a different way. So someone might tell their children about the inherited mutation well ahead of when their children are old enough to actually be tested. It really depends on the family and how you want to share that. But again, we don't test children because children can't be affected with cancer. And we want to preserve their right to decide if they want to be tested or not once they are adults. And so just like when we tell our kids about sex, we do it in a very slow and developmentally appropriate way. So the first time you get a question, you're not going to share all of the information, but you might start with your kids by telling them, you know, mommy had cancer, and so I have to take very good care of myself, and I go to the doctor to get regular checkups, and I take you to the doctor so you get checkups, and we do that so that we take care of ourselves. And then the next step is sometimes cancer could run in a family, and so you know, my sister is also careful to get her checkups, and then finally progressing to there's something inherited in our family, and I carry it and I might have passed it to you. So in a stepwise fashion, you're gradually educating your children about what this means. It's not an easy thing to do. It's hard to do. But we're here at Sharsheret to help you with materials so you can get some booklets that can make it easier to talk about these things with your kids. And you can we do family conference calls. So if you feel like you want to have a conversation across the miles with a genetic counselor involved as well, that's also something that we can facilitate.
So we're going to ask two more questions, and then again, just like was in the chat box, all questions will be answered. So one of the things we've started talking more about at Sharsheret, and somebody asked in the chat box this evening, is you mentioned that BRCA and some of these other mutations don't just impact risk for breast or ovarian cancer. So are there medical screening protocols for the other cancers that they raise risk for that we may want to partake in if we carry a mutation?
Okay, so that's a pretty broad and complicated question, but let's, you know, pick a couple of cancers. So with some of these genes, someone could be at an increased risk for colon cancer. And with Lynch syndrome, people need to have a colonoscopy actually done every year. And that's because with Lynch syndrome, someone is not any more likely than anyone else to develop a colon polyp. But with Lynch syndrome, a colon polyp can change from a polyp to cancer very, very quickly. And so in each case, it depends. Now, colon cancer, we have very good screening for, because colonoscopy, that is really the gold standard, because you can not only find a cancer early, but you can prevent cancer by removing polyps. There are other cancers. I'll mention ovarian cancer, similarly to pancreatic cancer. Those are two cancers that are very, very hard to screen for. Now, with ovarian cancer, even though it's hard to screen for, women can live very fine lives with their ovaries removed. And so we have that option. But with pancreatic cancer, you really can't live a good life without a pancreas. It's a much more critical organ. And so we're at the beginning with pancreatic cancer of being able to understand a little bit about screening. But I always recommend, if people want to pursue screening for pancreatic cancer, that they do that at a research center where they're involved in advancing our understanding of screening and pancreatic cancer at the same time that it may be helping you as well. So any questions about any particulars or another cancer that I didn't mention here in this very quick answer, please don't hesitate to be in touch.
One very simple question, because somebody asked it early and I want to get it in. So if someone is a man who carries a BRCA mutation, will they also be going for regular mammograms prior to, or MRIs before there is even a potential diagnosis?
No, so there is not really consensus about whether mammograms are of any value in men. And there are some doctors who recommend an annual mammogram for men with a BRCA mutation. But most say that a breast exam every year by the physician, and then the person who's a carrier themselves has got to get to know their own body and see if something is different in their breasts. And very often men don't notice changes in their breasts because they're not as attuned to it, because of breast cancer. First of all, so many men don't even realize that men get breast cancer, and men are just, are more likely to just ignore something that changes in their body, not being alerted the way many women would be. So it's important that you discuss these things with your doctor and get the best recommendation for your situation. But no regular breast screening generally for men other than a breast exam.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Bill. And I also want to thank today's sponsors, AstraZeneca, the Bassett Center for BRCA, the Sigmund and Edith Blumenthal Memorial Fund. This program was also presented under the Cooperative Agreement DP 19-1906 from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Max and Anna Barron, Ben and Sarah Barron, and Milton Barron Endowment Fund from the Jewish Community Foundation of LA. We will be posting a brief evaluation survey link in the chat box right now. I want to encourage you to click on it, spend less than 2 minutes answering those questions, because it's right there now, because your answers really do inform our future programming. Again, there were so many questions we didn't get to. I assure you, between blogs and emails, these will all be answered. And of course, if you have deeper questions or uniquely personal questions, you can always reach out to Sharsheret and make a telephone appointment with Peggy to have a deeper conversation. Remember that our social workers and Peggy as our genetic counselor are available to each and every one of you. You are our priority, your health, your well-being, and we are going to be here for you. So thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful night, and don't leave before you clicked on the evaluation survey. Again, good night.